The check was already in pieces before the wind took them. Darius Webb stood on the sidewalk in front of his building on a Tuesday afternoon in February, watching torn fragments of paper catch the gray air and scatter toward the gutter. $250,000 dissolved into confetti. The man in the black Mercedes watched through tinted glass, his expression shifting from confident to calculating in the space of 3 seconds. Darius didn't wait to see what came next. He turned, walked back through the lobby door, and let it close behind him. 6 weeks earlier, the fluorescent lights of Brooklyn Methodist's emergency room had a particular quality at 2 in the morning. Not quite white, not quite yellow. Something in between that made everything look provisional, like the world hadn't fully committed to existing yet. Darius noticed this detail because noticing small things was how he kept himself functional when larger things threatened to crack him open entirely. The color of the lights, the squeak of his left sneaker against linoleum, the right one silent. The way the intake nurse's keyboard clicked in groups of 3, then paused, then 3 more, a rhythm that had nothing to do with the words she was typing. His son's fingers were wrapped around his collar. Theo's grip, even at 6 years old, even with oxygen saturation dropping and his lips taking on that particular shade Darius had learned to recognize and dread, was stronger than it had any right to be. Darius held him against his chest and breathed slowly and deliberately, performing calm for an audience of 1, the same performance he'd been giving for 3 years now. Theo's heart fluttered against his ribs like something trying to escape. The intake nurse asked her questions without looking up. Name, date of birth, insurance provider, primary care physician, current medications. And here Darius had to pause, recite the full list from memory, the way other fathers might recite sports statistics or song lyrics. Enalapril 0.1 milligrams per kilogram, furosemide 1 milligram per kilogram, spironolactone 0.8. He knew the dosages the way he knew his own phone number, not because he'd studied them, but because forgetting was not an option he permitted himself. They were taken to an exam room where a physician with dark circles under her eyes and a stethoscope she pressed to Theo's back without preamble moved through the assessment with the brisk efficiency of someone at the tail end of a double shift. Chest x-ray, echocardiogram, a blood draw that made Theo cry in the silent way he'd developed lately, tears tracking down his face without any sound, like he'd decided crying out loud cost too much energy. Darius held his hand throughout and told him it was almost over the words, as automatic as breathing, just as necessary. The consultation room was smaller than the exam room and more serious. This was the room where doctors delivered news that required privacy. Darius had been in rooms like this before: a different hospital, a different diagnosis, the same particular stillness in the air that preceded information you couldn't unknow. The cardiologist was older, silver-haired, with steady hands that had probably held hundreds of moments just like this one. He pulled up images on a wall-mounted screen, pointed to shadows and shapes that meant nothing to Darius except that they were his son's heart failing in ways that could be measured and quantified and apparently scheduled. The ventricular septal defect had deteriorated significantly since the scan 6 months prior. At the current rate of progression, complete heart failure within 8 to 10 weeks. Surgery as soon as possible, patch the defect, reinforce the ventricular wall. A complex procedure. Theo was young and otherwise healthy. His chances would be good. The word good hung in the air between them, like something that hadn't decided yet whether to help or harm. Darius asked the price. The surgery itself ran approximately $180,000. Insurance would cover $40,000, leaving a balance of $140,000. Darius's voice came out steadier than he had any right to expect. "I don't have $140,000. He stood before the sentence was fully finished, the chair scraping against the floor. He asked for a moment alone. The cardiologist nodded with the practiced sympathy of a man who'd heard this particular response many times, which somehow made it worse. Darius didn't need to be understood. He needed a number he didn't have. He stood in the doorway of Theo's exam room and watched his son sleep on the narrow hospital bed, small chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance, one hand still curled in the shape it had held around Darius's collar. The Spider-Man pajamas were printed with webs going in every direction, which had been the point of choosing them. Theo had decided at 5.5 that Spider-Man was the best superhero because he made his own tools out of whatever he had. Darius had thought that was a pretty sophisticated observation for a 5-year-old. He still did. Renata would have known what to do next. This thought arrived as it always did, without warning and without mercy. 3 years since the leukemia had taken her, 3 years since a cold March morning in a cemetery in Queens, and still the thought came, Renata would know. She'd had this quality of applied intelligence that cut directly through complexity to the next practical step, skipping the paralysis that Darius sometimes got stuck in the place where options multiplied and none of them were good, and the mind just stopped. She'd made him promise in those last terrible weeks that he would take care of Theo no matter what, that he would never give up. He'd kept that promise for 3 years. He intended to keep it for considerably longer. The discharge nurse pressed a folder of papers into his hands along with a list of charitable organizations that sometimes assisted with surgical costs. Her eyes were full of the particular sympathy that Darius had learned to accept without letting it flatten him. Outside, the February sky was lightening to that specific pre-dawn gray that wasn't quite dark and wasn't quite morning, the color of something suspended between states. He carried Theo to the car he'd borrowed from the neighbor on the 3rd floor, the boy barely stirring, still heavy with sedative. The driver didn't speak during the ride back to Brooklyn, which Darius appreciated more than the man could have known. Their building looked the way it always did at this hour, brick graffiti, the 2nd floor window still covered with cardboard from a break-in the landlord hadn't bothered to address in 6 weeks. Darius climbed 4 flights with Theo's weight familiar against his shoulder, the way a particular kind of burden becomes familiar, and let himself into the studio apartment. 400 square feet, a kitchenette with 2 working burners, a bathroom where the hot water lasted 3 minutes before giving up, a fold-out couch that served as both his bed and Theo's because the square footage a separate sleeping area would require existed in the same category as $140,000, theoretically real, practically unreachable. He settled his son onto the couch, tucked the donated blanket with the dinosaur pattern around him, and stood looking at the folder of discharge papers on the kitchen counter. Emergency surgery required. 8 to 10 weeks maximum. $140,000. His checking account held $47. His next paycheck from the restaurant job would arrive in 8 days, $412, before taxes already spoken for 3 times over by rent and minimum credit card payments and Theo's medications. The financial analyst resume on his laptop had generated 23 rejection emails in 6 months, all variations on the same theme: overqualified skills, dated position filled internally. Thank you for your interest. He'd been good at his job once. Senior analyst at Meridian Capital Partners, pulling $70,000 a year with full benefits and a retirement account that was actually growing. Then Renata got sick, and someone had to be home during chemotherapy appointments. Someone had to be present at the school when Theo was learning to read and needed a parent who wasn't exhausted from treatment. Someone had to hold the shape of normal life together while everything collapsed. The choice hadn't felt like a sacrifice at the time. It had felt like the obvious next thing. Of course he quit. Of course he did. He'd thought that was the hardest part. He made coffee in the machine he'd found at a thrift store on Atlantic Avenue, the kind that sputtered and complained but still produced something drinkable if you didn't think too hard about it. The sun was coming up through windows he'd been meaning to clean since November. He had 90 minutes before his shift at Aurelius started. He showered in the 3 minutes before the water went cold, pulled on the black trousers and white button-down shirt that served as his server uniform, and examined the small stain near the collar that refused to fully disappear. In the dim lighting of Aurelius's dining room, no one would notice. No one ever noticed servers, unless something went wrong. Claudette Rivers knocked softly before using her key the way she'd done 5 mornings a week for the past 2 years. She was 68, retired from 30 years of teaching 4th grade in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and she refused to accept payment for childcare with a stubbornness that matched Darius's own. She said she'd raised 4 children largely alone and knew what the work looked like. Her eyes went immediately to Theo still sleeping, and then to Darius's face. She read both without asking. "I'll be back by 3. Darius shouldered his bag. He needs to rest today. Doctor said so. Claudette settled into the worn armchair by the window, already pulling out the knitting she brought every morning. Needles and yarn that had produced more Afghans than either of them could account for. "We'll be fine. You take care of yourself, Darius." The subway platform was crowded with the specific population of early morning Brooklyn nurses finishing night shifts, delivery drivers starting their days, people who worked multiple jobs to keep their heads incrementally above water. Darius found a space against the wall, closed his eyes and did the math he'd been avoiding since the consultation room. $140,000 at $12 an hour, assuming full-time hours he didn't have, assuming no taxes, no rent, no groceries, no medications. 11,667 hours, give or take. He opened his eyes and watched the tracks. Aurelius Restaurant occupied the ground floor of a federal-style building in Manhattan's financial district, the kind of establishment where breakfast cost what Darius spent on groceries for 2 weeks. He came in through the employee entrance on the side street, changed into his server apron in the break room that smelled like dish soap and institutional coffee, and arranged his face into the expression that passed for professional calm. He'd gotten good at this over months of practice, the version of himself that moved efficiently through expensive rooms without requiring acknowledgement that existed in the peripheral vision of people whose attention was elsewhere, that functioned perfectly well without being seen. Gwen Hartley was already in a state when he arrived. She managed the floor with the high-functioning anxiety of someone who'd learned to metabolize stress as a personality trait, and this particular morning she had a no-show server, a private dining room reservation, and an expression that suggested she was one more problem away from an event she wouldn't enjoy. She spotted Darius across the room and made her calculation in approximately 2 seconds. "Webb, you're taking the private dining room." His stomach dropped. "I've never worked private dining." "You have now. Marcus called in sick and you're the only one here who doesn't look like they're still recovering from last night." She shoved a tablet at him and started scrolling through reservation notes with her thumb. "Guest's name is Sloan Mercer. She owns approximately half the commercial real estate in Lower Manhattan, so I need you to be invisible, attentive, and completely without incident. Smile when appropriate, refill without being asked, and for everything holy, do not spill anything. Sloan Mercer." Even Darius, who didn't follow business news or track society pages or have the bandwidth for anything beyond the immediate geography of survival, recognized the name. Mercer Properties had its logo on a dozen buildings visible from the subway platform near his apartment. Forbes covers, charity galas in the back pages of newspapers he read while waiting for Theo at medical appointments. The kind of wealth that existed in a categorically different atmosphere from people who counted the days until payday. The private dining room was all glass and restraint floor-to-ceiling windows looking down at the street, a single table set with precision that suggested someone had measured the distances between objects. Fresh orchids in a low arrangement at the center. Silverware polished to the point where it reflected the overhead light in small specific ways. A menu without prices because anyone eating here didn't need to ask. Darius checked his reflection in the window, smoothed the collar of his uniform over the stain. Took a breath. 90 minutes. He needed to get through 90 minutes of being professionally invisible, and then he could go home and sit with the impossibility of $140,000 and figure out what to do next. Sloan Mercer arrived at 7:30 exactly. She didn't look like the Forbes photographs. The photograph showed a woman carved from intention, severe lines, controlled posture, the expression of someone who had arranged her face into authority and left it there. The woman who walked through the door of the private dining room was wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit and moving with the automatic confidence of someone who'd never needed to consider whether she belonged somewhere. But she was tired in a way that expensive clothing couldn't fully conceal. The shadows under her eyes were real, not cosmetic. The set of her jaw spoke to a specific kind of stress, not the passing kind, but the sustained, grinding variety that came from a problem that hadn't resolved in weeks or months. She was already on her phone mid-sentence, not looking at Darius, as she set a leather briefcase down beside the chair and dropped into it with less grace than her entrance had suggested. Her voice was controlled and sharp, the tone of someone who expected the people on the other end of her calls to match her pace. I don't care what the zoning board says, find the workaround. We have 6 weeks until groundbreaking, and I'm not moving the timeline because someone wants a larger envelope." A pause while the speakerphone offered something about delegation and rest. "Call me when you have a solution." She ended the call, set the phone on the table face down, and looked up. Her eyes were a pale blue that registered everything in the room in what felt like a single sweep. She looked at Darius the way people in her position looked at servers, a quick, efficient acknowledgement of a functional presence, the way you might note the placement of a chair. "Coffee, black, and I'll have the smoked salmon with poached eggs." "Right away, Ms. Mercer." He turned toward the door, and the door swung open. Later, reviewing it in his mind, Darius would understand that he had approximately 1.5 seconds between the moment the door opened and the moment physics became inevitable. Lena Schraft, 19 years old. Second week on the job, single mother of a 10-month-old moving too fast with a tray of water pitchers because someone in the kitchen had told her to hurry, didn't see the single step down into the private dining area. Her foot caught the edge. The tray tilted forward. The water arced in a clean crystalline wave aimed directly at the back of Sloane Mercer's chair. Darius moved without deciding to. His hand caught Lena's arm and pulled her sideways as the tray went down, the sound of it hitting marble ricocheting off the glass walls in a way that seemed impossibly loud. Water splashed across his uniform, cold and immediate, soaking through the shirt to his shoulder. Ceramic shards skittered across the floor. A puddle spread toward the legs of Sloane Mercer's chair. For a moment, no one in the room breathed. Lena had gone still beside him, her face the particular white of someone running calculations about rent and childcare. Sloane Mercer stood slowly from her chair, water droplets on the sleeve of her suit jacket, and turned around with an expression Darius couldn't read. The words came out of him before he'd processed them. "I'm so sorry. That was completely my fault. I should have been watching the door." Sloane's expression shifted not toward anger exactly, but toward something more precise. One eyebrow moved slightly. "Your fault. You weren't carrying the tray." "I was blocking the path. I apologize for the disruption, Ms. Mercer. I'll get you a towel and fresh coffee immediately." He could feel Lena trembling beside him close enough that the vibration was physical. He could hear Gwen's heels clicking rapidly across the restaurant floor toward them. This was the part where he'd be fired. He understood this as a practical matter without drama. He'd been let go from jobs for less, and he needed this job more than he'd needed almost anything in recent memory. But Lena had a 10-month-old and 2 weeks of employment behind her and nowhere near the margin of error that came with experience. Sloane studied him. The assessment lasted long enough to become uncomfortable, her gaze moving from his face to his soaked uniform to Lena half visible behind his shoulder. "What's your name?" "Darius Webb." "How long have you worked here, Darius Webb?" 6 months. "And her?" A slight nod toward Lena. "This is her 2nd week." Gwen arrived breathless and flushed phone out to call maintenance, ready to deploy the specific combination of apology and efficiency that kept wealthy customers from filing complaints. She started talking immediately, and Sloane didn't look at her. "It was an accident. These things happen." Sloane sat back down with the particular composure of someone who had decided how she felt about a situation and wasn't interested in revisiting the decision. "I'd still like my coffee, and someone should clean up the glass before anyone else gets hurt." Gwen grabbed Lena's arm and steered her toward the kitchen. Darius stood in the private dining room for 3 seconds alone with Sloane Mercer, not entirely sure what had just happened. She'd picked up her phone and was checking messages as though nothing had occurred. "Your coffee, Ms. Mercer. Right away." In the kitchen, he changed into a borrowed shirt, black instead of white, close enough in the dining room lighting, and made fresh coffee with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. He returned to the private dining room, brought extra lemon with the salmon without being asked, refilled her water glass with the silent efficiency that good service required, and otherwise ceased to exist in any way that required acknowledgement. Sloane ate in focused silence for 20 minutes, working through whatever was on her tablet with the concentration of someone for whom breakfast was a secondary activity. Darius had nearly convinced himself the incident was finished when she spoke without looking up. "You lied." His throat tightened. "Ms. Mercer." You weren't blocking any path. Her eyes lifted from the screen direct and without accusation, something closer to genuine curiosity operating behind them. You claimed responsibility anyway. Why? He could have maintained the position, could have insisted the explanation was true. Instead, something about the directness of the question, the absence of performance in it, the sense that she was actually asking produced an honest answer. She's new, probably needs this job. I figured I had a better chance of surviving the complaint than she did. Sloane picked up her coffee cup with a deliberate movement, took a slow sip, set it down in exactly the same position. The silence expanded. That's either incredibly noble or incredibly stupid. Something loosened slightly in his chest. Probably both. For the first time since she'd walked into the room, Sloane Mercer smiled. It was small, barely a shift at the corner of her mouth, but it was real in a way that changed the geometry of her face, made her look younger and considerably less like the woman in the Forbes photographs. I'll be back next Thursday, same time. I'd like you as my server again. Of course, Ms. Mercer. She pulled out a wallet, sleek black leather, and set $500 bills on the table. Darius looked at them and looked again. The breakfast had cost perhaps $45. Ms. Mercer, I think you've made an error. She was already moving toward the door, briefcase in hand. I didn't. See you next week, Darius Webb. The door closed with a soft, definitive click. He stood alone in the private dining room with $500 in cash and the specific disorientation of someone who'd been expecting a punishment and received the opposite. Gwen appeared in the doorway approximately 30 seconds later, her expression caught between relief and suspicion in proportions that kept shifting. Did she complain? Darius held up the bills. She left this. Gwen's eyes went wide in a way that briefly suspended her professional composure entirely. What did you do? I served her breakfast. Well, whatever that actually means, I'm putting you on private dining permanently. She was already walking away, talking to herself about quarterly numbers and client retention scores. Darius pocketed the money carefully and stood for a moment longer in the private dining room, looking out at the financial district below. People in good coats moving along the sidewalk with the purposeful rhythm of people who had places to be. Across the street, a building with the Mercer Properties logo on its facade caught the morning light. $500, 2 weeks of his janitorial salary. Real money, immediate money, the kind that paid the electric bill and replaced Theo's sneakers that were now a full size too small, and a rounding error, a decimal point correction against $140,000. He finished his shift in a state he could only describe as suspended. His body performed the familiar choreography of the dining room clearing, refilling, anticipating, while his mind turned the morning over and over without finding an angle from which it made complete sense. The wealthy woman who had every reason to be furious about a water incident had been neither furious nor particularly concerned. She'd asked a direct question and received an honest answer and left $500 like it cost her nothing to do so because it cost her nothing to do so. By the time he clocked out at 3 and took the subway back to Brooklyn, his feet aching in the specific way that came from hours of hard floors, the money in his pocket had become something he was already calculating around. $500. That was the electric bill, Theo's sneakers, the minimum payment on the credit card with the highest interest rate. It was nothing in the direction of $140,000. But it was a number that hadn't existed this morning. The afternoon Theo spent with Claudette, who had apparently been teaching him to play chess with a patience Darius frankly envied. He arrived to find his son sitting across from Claudette at her kitchen table, studying the board with an intensity that looked completely serious, until Theo noticed his father in the doorway and immediately abandoned the game to cross the room at a speed that the cardiologist would have considered inadvisable. Darius caught him, lifted him, held on for a moment longer than usual. "You smell like restaurant," Theo informed him. "I work in a restaurant." "You smell like the expensive part. After dinner, beans and rice." Theo's current preferred meal, which Darius had accepted as a victory on nutritional grounds, they sat at the kitchen table with the drawing Theo had been working on since that morning. 3 figures, a tall one, a small one, and a shape behind them both that was rendered in yellow crayon, radiating lines in all directions, the way children drew the sun. "Who's the yellow one?" Darius asked, though he already knew. Theo looked at him with the expression of someone explaining something obvious. "Me." He'd picked up the Vietnamese word from a documentary he'd watched with Claudette once and decided it was more specific than the English for reasons he hadn't fully articulated. "She stands behind us, so we don't have to look backward to know she's there." Darius set the drawing on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a pineapple that had come with the apartment. He stood looking at it for a moment. 3 figures, the yellow light behind them, and thought about 8 to 10 weeks and $140,000, and a woman who'd left $500 on a table like it was a reasonable thing to do. That night, after Theo was asleep on the fold-out couch in the particular sprawled configuration that suggested deep unconsciousness, Darius sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and the folder of discharge papers and tried to build something out of impossible numbers. The charitable organizations on the list had application processes with timelines measured in months. Crowdfunding campaigns succeeded when people had social networks large enough to generate momentum, which required a kind of visibility Darius had spent 3 years actively avoiding. Payment plans from the hospital would require income he no longer had at the level needed to service the debt within any time frame that mattered. He closed the laptop and listened to Theo breathe in the next room. 8 weeks. $140,000. $47 in his checking account and $500 in his pocket, and a woman who'd said she was coming back on Thursday. He wasn't a man who placed bets. He was a man who did the math, identified the most viable path, and moved down it with whatever resources he had. But the math at the moment had only one variable that wasn't fixed, and it had walked out of the private dining room at Aurelius at 7:53 in the morning with a leather briefcase and $500 left behind like an afterthought. He went to bed on the floor beside the fold-out couch. He'd given up the couch itself when Theo started needing extra rest and stared at the ceiling and thought about nothing specific until sleep arrived, which took longer than he would have liked. In the morning, Theo woke before him the way Theo almost always did, and by the time Darius was up and functional, his son was already at the kitchen table drawing again. The scene was similar to yesterday's 3 figures, but this time there was a 4th shape at the edge of the paper, vaguely rectangular with what appeared to be small squares arranged across its surface. "What's the new one?" Theo looked up with the gap-toothed smile that had been there since he'd lost his first tooth 3 months ago, and that Darius had quietly decided was the best thing he'd ever seen. "That's a rocket ship. I'm building it when I'm bigger." A pause, crayon still moving. "What's for breakfast?" "Eggs." "Can we have the kind with the cheese in them?" "Yes." Theo returned to the rocket ship satisfied. Darius cracked eggs into the pan with the broken handle and watched his son draw and thought about Sloan Mercer coming back on Thursday and about how long 8 weeks actually was measured in mornings like this one, and whether that was enough time for the world to produce $140,000 for a man who had nothing to offer it except the truth. He didn't know the answer. He knew how to make eggs. He knew where his son's medications were and what order they needed to be taken and which side Theo preferred to sleep on when the nights were difficult. He knew how to show up to work and do the job correctly and tell the truth when someone asked him a direct question. Whether any of that was worth $140,000 remained for now an open question. Thursday came back the way necessary things do, without fanfare, without the courtesy of feeling like an opportunity rather than a test. Darius arrived at Aurelius 40 minutes early, changed into his uniform in the break room, and stood in the private dining room for a moment before the restaurant opened, looking at the single table with its precise arrangement and thinking about nothing he could afford to think about. He moved the orchid centerpiece 3 centimeters to the left, then back. It didn't matter. He put it back where it had been. Sloan arrived at 7:30 exactly. Same charcoal suit, different cut. Same shadows under her eyes, which meant whatever was grinding at her hadn't resolved in a week. She set her briefcase beside the chair with the practiced motion of someone who'd been doing this particular thing in this particular way for years, settled in, and opened her tablet before she'd fully sat down. She didn't look up when Darius poured her water. She didn't need to. He refilled her coffee twice during the meal without being asked, brought extra lemon when he noticed her reach for the small dish and find it empty, and otherwise maintained the professional distance that the room required. When she finished, she closed her tablet and set $500 on the table with the same deliberate placement she'd used the previous week. Darius looked at the bills. "Ms. Mercer, you protected someone who needed protecting." Her attention had already shifted to gathering her briefcase. "That's worth more than salmon and eggs. Same time next week." He stood in the room after she left and counted the money twice, not because he doubted the amount, but because the act of counting gave his hands something to do while his mind processed the arithmetic. $500. 2 weeks running. $1,000 total against $140,000. Against 8 weeks now reduced to 7. The pattern established itself with the reliability of a structural element. Every Thursday at 7:30, Sloane Mercer walked through the door of the private dining room and conducted her breakfast the same way, tablet open, phone face down. Unless the call was unavoidable, focused and self-contained in the manner of someone who had learned to treat solitude as a professional skill. She ordered the same meal. She tipped $500. She left. By the third Thursday, Darius had stopped trying to return the money. By the fourth, Gwen had stopped looking surprised and started looking at him with the specific wariness of someone trying to identify an advantage they hadn't yet understood. At home, the money was changing things in increments too small to feel like progress, but too real to dismiss. Theo had new sneakers that fit. The electric bill was current for the first time in 4 months. The credit card with the highest interest rate had received a payment large enough to stop the penalty fees from compounding. The surgery fund, which Darius tracked in a notebook he kept in the kitchen drawer beside the takeout menus, had grown to numbers that still seemed impossibly distant from 140,000, but were no longer a single digit. Theo noticed the sneakers immediately and wore them for 3 consecutive days without taking them off, including to bed on the first night until Darius insisted. He noticed the other changes less directly, the way the apartment was slightly warmer because the radiator had been bled properly, the way breakfast included things that hadn't been in the budget 2 months ago. He was 6 years old and perceptive in the particular way of children who have spent time in hospitals, which is to say he noticed everything and chose carefully what to ask about. On the evening of the third week, Darius mentioned in passing that he'd been working a private event on Friday, serving dinner for a group of business people in Manhattan. Theo processed this while pushing rice around his plate with the focused inattention of someone thinking about something else entirely. "The woman you serve on Thursdays," his son finally offered, not quite a question. "Does she ever smile?" Darius considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. Not often." Theo nodded once the way he nodded when something confirmed a theory he'd already formed. People who don't smile much are usually the saddest ones, because they've been practicing not showing it for so long they forgot how. A pause. "That's what Mom used to say about the grumpy man who lived downstairs." Darius set down his fork. The grumpy man who'd lived downstairs had moved out before Theo turned 4, which meant he was drawing on a memory of something Renata had said that had lodged somewhere in him, and waited until it was relevant. This happened with Theo. Renata surfaced in him at unexpected angles, her particular way of seeing the world having apparently transferred in ways that neither of them could fully account for. He didn't say anything. Sometimes the right response to his son was silence that acknowledged the weight of what had just been said without diminishing it, by adding to it. The fourth Thursday arrived with Sloane looking worse than any of the previous 3 weeks combined. She was 10 minutes late, which had not happened before. Her hair was pulled back in a way that was functional rather than intentional, and she settled into her chair with a heaviness that her posture usually worked to conceal. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup before she'd taken a sip, like she was borrowing its warmth. Darius stood at the appropriate distance and gave her the room. He'd learned over 4 Thursdays that she used silence the way some people used speech, to organize, to process, to arrive somewhere she needed to be before continuing. He'd also learned without meaning to that she preferred her second cup of coffee slightly cooler than the first, that she read documents in a specific order that moved from longest to shortest, and that she always looked at her phone at 8:45, regardless of whether it had buzzed, which suggested a standing notification she'd stopped consciously registering. When she spoke, she didn't look up from the untouched surface of her coffee. "Do you ever feel like you're running at full speed and still losing ground?" The question landed closer than she could have intended, 7 weeks now since the diagnosis. Surgery fund at $31,000, a number that had seemed impossible 2 months ago, and now felt like standing at the base of a mountain and pointing to a ledge near the top. "Every day," Darius answered, and meant it in every direction at once. Sloane looked up. This was different from the way she'd looked at him in previous weeks, less assessment, more recognition. The expression of someone finding an unexpected equivalent. "I have a former partner trying to take my company. He's been acquiring shares for months, and I didn't see the full picture until it was almost too late." She set the cup down. "His name is Preston Hale. I ended our relationship 3 years ago, and he apparently decided the appropriate response was to spend those 3 years building toward this." Darius had no frame of reference for corporate warfare conducted at that scale, no language for the specific mechanics of hostile acquisition, but he understood sustained vindictiveness as a concept. He understood what it meant when someone with resources decided to treat another person as a problem to be solved through attrition. "That sounds like a man who never learned to lose gracefully." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but a softening around the edges of her controlled composure. "That's one way to describe it." She looked at her phone, then back at him. "You don't read about me, do you? You don't know anything about my life outside these Thursday mornings." "I try not to make assumptions about people based on what someone else decided was worth publishing." "That's rare." She picked up her coffee. "Everyone in my professional life wants something. They're polite and attentive, and they wait for the right moment. You tried to give back money I'd already decided to leave." He thought about Theo's sneakers and the surgery fund notebook in the kitchen drawer. The honest answer was complicated, so he gave her the part of it that was cleanest. "I just do the job correctly, Bob." Her phone buzzed against the table, and she looked at it, the exhaustion returning to her face with the immediacy of something that had only been briefly suspended. "Emergency board meeting." She stood, gathered her briefcase with movement slightly less precise than usual. Then she paused in the doorway, and the question she turned back to ask was the last one he expected. "Are you happy, Darius?" 3 years since anyone had asked him that. 3 years of survival conducted at too close a range to permit the question. He thought about Theo drawing rocket ships at the kitchen table and about Renata's voice telling him to take care of their son no matter what. And he answered the only way he knew how to answer direct questions. "I have Theo. That's enough." "But is it what you wanted?" "This life?" Something in the question opened a space he'd kept sealed. "No, but it's what I have." She held his gaze for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read, something between understanding and a kind of grief that wasn't for him specifically, but recognized his situation from the inside. "I'll see you next week." She left, and the room held the particular quiet of a space where something important had just occurred that neither party had named. The following Friday, Wallace Price called Darius on his personal cell with an offer from Sloane private event staff for a dinner at her penthouse in Tribeca, 10 guests, 7 to 11. $2,000 for the evening. $2,000. Darius stood in the break room at the restaurant holding his phone and doing arithmetic that had become second nature. $31,000 in the surgery fund, 70 weeks worth of Thursday tips in 5 weeks, $109,000 still needed 6 weeks remaining on the timeline the cardiologist had given them. He told Wallace he'd be there. Claudette listened to all of this that afternoon without interrupting her knitting needles, maintaining their steady rhythm, the sound of them like a metronome set to a tempo that had nothing to do with urgency. When he finished, she counted 3 more stitches before responding. People with that kind of money don't extend that kind of attention without reason. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact delivered with the particular directness of a woman who had spent 30 years telling 9-year-olds the truth about how things worked. That doesn't mean her reasons are wrong, just means you should know what they are. The penthouse occupied an entire floor of a glass building in Tribeca, a fact that didn't fully register until the service elevator opened, and Darius stepped into a space where the floor-to-ceiling windows looked directly across at the Hudson, the lights of New Jersey, a slow-moving suggestion on the water. The furniture managed to be simultaneously comfortable and priceless. The art on the walls belonged in institutions. The space itself was the physical argument for a particular kind of success, not merely wealthy, but the kind of wealthy that had long since stopped needing to announce itself. Wallace Price briefed Darius alongside two other servers who did this professionally and moved through pre-event preparation with the coordinated efficiency of people who'd worked together before. Darius followed their lead and asked the questions that would get him through the evening without incident. The guests arrived in the specific way that powerful people arrived, to things confident accustomed their conversations already in progress as they walked through the door. They spoke in compressed financial shorthand, referenced companies and regulatory decisions and personnel moves, the way Darius had once discussed equity positions with colleagues at Meridian a lifetime ago in a different version of himself. He moved through the room with the practiced invisibility of good service, refilling glasses, clearing plates existing at the precise margin where attentiveness and absence met. Sloane presided over it all with an authority that was nothing like the tired woman who ordered smoked salmon on Thursday mornings. This version was fully armored midnight blue dress hair arranged something in her bearing that commanded the room without requiring any explicit effort. She was brilliant at it, the performance seamless and apparently effortless, and Darius found himself thinking about what Theo had said about people who'd practiced not showing things until they'd forgotten how. Twice during the dinner across the length of the room, Sloane's eyes found his. Not the sweep of a host checking on service. Something more specific, a brief acknowledgement, a check-in, as if confirming that at least one person in the room was operating without an agenda she needed to manage. Both times he held her gaze for a moment and then returned to his work, and both times she looked away first. The guests departed at 11 as promised. Wallace dismissed the other two servers and asked Darius to remain for final cleanup, a request that seemed logistically unnecessary given the other servers' experience, but which Darius accepted without comment. By midnight, the penthouse was restored, and Wallace appeared with an envelope. $2,500. Not $2,000. Darius stood in the service elevator going down and looked at the extra bills and felt the specific discomfort of receiving more than was agreed. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was something more deliberate than that, and deliberate things from people with resources deserve to be examined rather than simply accepted. He thought about Claudette's needles and her metronome and her careful non-accusation all the way back to Brooklyn. 3 weeks of this pattern, Thursdays at Aurelius, occasional private events at rates that exceeded the agreed amounts, the surgery fund growing in the notebook in the kitchen drawer. Theo's next cardiology appointment showed no improvement, but no acceleration of deterioration, which the cardiologist described as the best news available under the circumstances. $43,000 in the fund. $97,000 still needed. 5 weeks on the revised timeline. The math was becoming less impossible, which was different from becoming possible. Then came the Tuesday morning that announced itself wrong from the moment the phone started buzzing at 6:15. Darius was making eggs, same pan, same broken-handle Theo at the table with crayons, when the first text arrived from a number he didn't recognize. Then another. Then 3 in quick succession, then a call from a delivery service colleague, then notifications from social media platforms he checked perhaps once a week. He ignored them and focused on the eggs and told himself it was probably nothing, some minor internet event that had briefly attached his name to something benign. He clicked the first link when the count reached 17 missed calls and 23 messages because at that number it was no longer something he could responsibly decline to know. The page loaded slowly on his phone. Then he was looking at a photograph of himself leaving Sloan Mercer's building at 12:41 in the morning, taken with a telephoto lens from across the street. The headline read, "Mystery Man Leaving Billionaire Sloan Mercer's Penthouse Secret Romance," or something more sinister. He scrolled with fingers that had gone cold. There were photographs of him pouring coffee at Aurelius taken through the restaurant window at an angle that turned professional service into something that looked like private intimacy. There was a photograph of Sloan smiling. The small, real smile she'd produced exactly twice in his presence, captured through the same window and cropped to suggest a context it didn't have. There were quotes from sources described as close to Mercer Properties confirming that the unidentified man had been seen regularly at the CEO's private residence and had received substantial financial compensation for reasons that remained unclear. The nature of their relationship, the article suggested, had raised questions among Manhattan's business community. Some believed the billionaire CEO might be the victim of manipulation by someone seeking access to her considerable fortune. Victim. Manipulation. Darius put the phone face down on the counter and looked at Theo, who was drawing something with careful concentration, his new sneakers visible under the table, both feet swinging slightly above the floor. The phone rang. Gwen Hartley's name on the screen. "Don't come in." Her professional composure was fully gone, replaced by something flatter and more final. "You're suspended pending investigation. There are reporters outside the restaurant asking questions." "Gwen, I was working. I served dinner at private events she hired me for. That's it." "It doesn't look like that's it." A pause that contained a decision she'd already made. "Don't contact anyone from the restaurant until you hear from HR." She disconnected. Darius set the phone on the counter and turned off the eggs that had been burning for the last 2 minutes without him noticing. The delivery service called next. Community standards policy, the representative explained in the careful language of corporate liability, required that contractors whose public profiles had become associated with ongoing media scrutiny be temporarily suspended pending review. The warehouse called 20 minutes later. A manager who'd always been decent to him explained that given the current media attention, it would be better for everyone if Darius took some time before returning to his shifts. He thanked the manager for calling personally and ended the call and stood in his kitchen understanding what had just happened. 4 jobs, 24 hours, 0 income. He sat on the edge of the fold-out couch, the springs familiar through the thin cushion, and did arithmetic that no longer had any optimistic interpretation. $43,000 in the surgery fund, $97,000 still needed. 5 weeks, rent due in 11 days. Theo's medications needed to be refilled in 8. The surgery fund was a savings account, now not an operating account. If he spent it on rent and medications while waiting for income to resume, it stopped being a surgery fund and became something else entirely. Theo looked up from his drawing. "Daddy, are you okay?" "I'm thinking." "About what?" Darius looked at his son. The gap-toothed smile, currently absent, replaced by the careful attention Theo deployed when he sensed something his father wasn't saying. "About how to fix something. Can I help?" "Not yet." He crossed to the table and sat beside his son and looked at what Theo was drawing. The rocket ship, again more detailed than previous versions, with small figures visible in the windows. "Who's in it?" Theo pointed to each figure in turn. "Us. And Mom. She's the pilot because she's the best at knowing where to go." When Darius walked Theo to the school bus stop 40 minutes later, there were 2 people with cameras waiting outside the building. They started shooting the moment the door opened. The sound of rapid shutters was physical, percussive wrong in a way that tightened every muscle in his body simultaneously. Theo's hand found his and gripped hard. "Mr. Webb, can you comment on your relationship with Sloan Mercer?" A man with a microphone and a jacket that cost more than Darius's monthly rent stepped forward with the practiced advance of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. "Is it true she's been paying you privately?" Darius kept walking, his body angled between the cameras and his son, his hand firm around Theo's. He didn't look at either photographer. He looked at the end of the block and moved toward it. Theo's voice was small and tight. "Why are they taking pictures?" "Because they're confused about something. Keep walking." At the bus stop, Darius crouched to Theo's level with his back to the photographer who'd followed them down the block. He held both his son's hands and kept his voice steady in the way that required effort when the alternative was making things worse. "Listen to me. Some people are going to ask questions for a while. If anyone approaches you at school, any adult you don't know, you find your teacher immediately. You don't answer questions. Do you understand?" Theo's bottom lip held steady through what was clearly an effort to keep it that way. "Did you do something bad?" "No." "Then why?" Because sometimes people decide what they think before they check whether it's true. He squeezed his son's hands once. But you know who I am, and I know who I am. That part doesn't change because someone with a camera says something different. The bus arrived. Theo held the hug longer than usual before climbing the steps, and Darius watched the yellow shape of it move down the street until it turned a corner, then stood on the sidewalk alone and took 3 slow breaths and turned to face the remaining photographer directly. "I have nothing to say. Please leave me alone." He went back inside and locked the door and sat in the apartment that felt smaller than it ever had. His phone refusing to stop declining every incoming call from numbers he didn't recognize, while the social media notifications accumulated in a column of alerts he wouldn't let himself read again. Wallace Price called on the landline at 10:47. "Ms. Mercer is currently in meetings with her legal team. She asked me to contact you directly." Wallace's British precision was, if anything, more composed under pressure than in ordinary circumstances. "She's aware of everything that's occurring. Her lawyers are preparing a statement clarifying the nature of your professional relationship. She also wanted me to give you her private number in case you need to reach her directly." Darius wrote it on the back of an electric bill with a pen that kept skipping. "Tell her I'm sorry. I don't know how this happened, but none of this was supposed to land on her. She knows that." A brief pause. "She also wanted me to tell you she's handling it." Those were her specific words. He sat with the number in front of him for 11 minutes before calling. Sloane answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the controlled tension of someone managing multiple crises simultaneously while appearing to manage none of them. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. I don't understand what's happening, but I need you to know I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't give anyone anything." "I know you didn't." The way she said it held no hesitation, which meant she'd already concluded this before he confirmed it. "This is Preston. He hired a private investigator months ago. The photographer, the leaked photographs, the anonymous sources, all of it traces back to him. I should have anticipated this. I should have been more careful about—" She stopped. "About what hiring someone to serve dinner." A silence that felt like it contained something she was deciding whether to say. "About letting myself have one part of my week that felt real." Her voice shifted slightly, losing a layer of the professional exterior that usually armored it completely. "Everyone in my world performs. They network, and they calculate, and they wait for openings. You tried to give me back a tip because you thought it was too much. That's not a category of person I encounter often." Darius looked at the surgery fund notebook on the kitchen counter and thought about everything. He hadn't told her every calculation he'd run. Every reason the money she'd left mattered in ways she couldn't see. He thought about what it meant to receive kindness from someone and need it for reasons other than the ones they were giving it. "I'm not exactly uncomplicated either." "No one real is." The voices in the background on her end grew briefly louder. People waiting, decisions accumulating. "Preston is going to come to you. Maybe not this week, but soon. He's going to offer you money to say I was inappropriate with you, that I used my position made you uncomfortable, that there was something improper in how I conducted myself." She paused, and what came next was delivered without softening. "I need you to say no, whatever he offers." The implication landed fully and without cushioning. She was right to have said it, which made it harder to hear. He was in exactly the kind of position where a person could construct a justification for almost anything, and she understood this clearly enough to address it directly rather than hoping it didn't require addressing. He respected that more than if she'd simply trusted him without acknowledging the reality. "I don't lie about people who've treated me decently. That's not a line I've ever crossed, and it's not one I'll start crossing now." The exhale that followed that sentence was quiet and brief, but it carried a weight of relief she hadn't bothered to conceal. "Thank you." They talked for a few minutes about Theo, about whether the reporters were still outside his building, about whether he had enough to cover immediate expenses while the employment situation was suspended. Then she said she had to go. Her PR team was waiting, and she was sorry he was going through this, and he was handling it better than most people would, and she'd be in touch. After she hung up, Darius sat in the quiet apartment for a long time. He looked at the surgery fund notebook and at the discharge papers from Brooklyn Methodist and at the drawing Theo had left on the table, the rocket ship with its 3 passengers, Renata at the controls. He thought about Preston Hale, whom he'd looked up briefly after Sloan first mentioned his name, and about what it meant to build 3 years of your life around destroying someone else's. He thought about Claudette's observation, delivered between stitches, that people with that kind of money and that kind of attention always had reasons. He thought about the fact that he still had $43,000 in a surgery fund that was no longer growing a son, with 5 weeks left on a cardiologist's timeline and 0 current income. And somewhere out there, apparently, a man in an expensive car was going to arrive with money and a script and a version of events that would require Darius to become someone he'd spent his entire adult life not being. He thought about Renata and about promises made in the specific gravity of last week's, and about what it meant to raise a child who would eventually be old enough to know the full shape of who his father had been when things got hard. The answer to Preston Hale when he came was already decided. It had been decided in the consultation room at Brooklyn Methodist when Darius stood up from a chair he could barely feel and understood that the only thing left that was entirely his was the particular quality of his own character. That was not for sale, not for $140,000, not for $250, not for anything this world had to offer in exchange. He just needed Theo to still be alive on the other side of it. Preston Hale arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never needed to rush anything because money had always arrived before he did. The black Mercedes sat at the curb with its engine running, and he stepped out before Darius reached the trash bins, moving with the ease of someone for whom sidewalks existed as staging areas for conversations he'd already won. Darius dropped the bag into the bin and turned back toward his building without slowing. Preston fell into step beside him. "I'm not a reporter. I'm someone who wants to help you." His tone was warm, conversational, the register of a man explaining something obvious to someone he found mildly interesting. "I know about your son's surgery. I know the gap between what your insurance covers and what the procedure actually costs. I know about the jobs you lost this week." Darius stopped walking. The fact of it settled over him like cold water that this man had assembled the interior details of their survival into a dossier, had sat somewhere comfortable and mapped the specific pressure points of a 6-year-old's medical history and a father's empty checking account. This was what sustained resources looked like when applied to a human target. Not anger, not passion, just information organized and ready. Preston produced an envelope from his jacket, cream paper thick, a single document inside. He held it with the care of someone presenting something they already knew would be accepted. One conversation. Tell people that Sloan Mercer used her position to make you uncomfortable, that you needed the money and couldn't say no, that a powerful woman took advantage of a situation she created. A pause. You give one interview confirming what people are already halfway to believing, and I make sure you never worry about money again. He opened the envelope. The check was made out to Darius Webb, $250,000. Real bank, real signature, real ink, fully dried. Darius held it and let himself understand it completely because he owed himself that much honesty. This was not a symbolic number. This was Theo's surgery paid in full with $110,000 left. This was the credit card debt gone. This was a bedroom door Theo could close a savings account with an actual floor. The specific freedom of not calculating every purchase against every other one. He thought about what it would cost. Not to him. He'd already decided what it would cost to him and had accepted the price before Preston's car pulled up. He thought about what it would cost Theo, not the money, not the material facts of their life. He thought about the morning some years from now when his son would be old enough to understand the full shape of what had happened here. Old enough to ask the question directly. Old enough to look at the answer and know what it meant about what he himself was permitted to be. He tore the check in half, then in half again. He let the 4 pieces go, and the February wind took them in different directions, indifferent and immediate. Preston went very still. The warmth left his face without drama, revealing the person underneath the man who had spent 3 years and considerable resources building toward the destruction of a woman who had simply chosen to leave. What remained in his expression was calculation, cold and patient and entirely unsurprised. "Your son will die because of your pride." Darius met his eyes without flinching. "My son will live knowing his father didn't become someone he'd need to apologize for." The words came from somewhere that didn't require effort because they'd been true for longer than this moment. Can you say that about yourself? Can you look at what you've built these last 3 years and call it something worth leaving behind? Preston had no answer for that, or chose not to spend one here. He turned, walked back to the Mercedes, and was gone. The sidewalk was quiet. The torn pieces of the check had already blown out of sight. Darius stood alone for a moment and took stock of what he had: $43,000 in a surgery fund, 0 current income, 5 weeks on a cardiologist's timeline, and the full, uncompromised weight of his own character. It would have to be enough. It had always had to be enough. He went inside. Wallace Price arrived at his door at 4:17 in person rather than by phone, which told Darius before a word was spoken that what he was carrying required a human hand. Wallace stood in the hallway with his characteristic stillness, holding a plain white envelope, and delivered Sloane's words with the precision of someone who had memorized them exactly as given. "This is not charity. It is what happens when a person behaves with integrity in circumstances specifically designed to make integrity impossible, and the world occasionally imperfectly responds in kind." Darius opened the envelope. A letter from the surgical coordinator at Brooklyn Methodist printed on hospital letterhead. The balance of $140,000 on the surgical account for Theodore Webb had been satisfied in full by an anonymous benefactor. Payment processed at 9:47 that morning. 9:47 in the morning. Hours before Preston's Mercedes appeared at the curb. Hours before the check and the torn pieces and the cold February air. Sloane had made this decision before she knew what he would do with Preston's offer, before the test existed to be passed or failed. She hadn't paid the bill as a reward. She had paid it because she'd decided Theo deserved to live, and that decision had nothing to do with what Darius chose on a sidewalk 6 hours later. He stood in his doorway and read the letter twice. Then he looked up at Wallace. She knew Preston was coming today. She knew he was watching your building. Wallace held his gaze steadily. She wanted Theo's situation resolved before Mr. Hale's offer became a variable. She felt it was important that her decision have nothing to do with yours. The particular precision of that, the deliberate removal of any transactional logic, the refusal to make her generosity conditional on his choices, said more about Sloane Mercer than any Forbes profile had managed to capture. Darius folded the letter carefully and put it in his jacket pocket beside his heart. He called her that evening after collecting Theo from Claudette's and getting his son fed and settled after the surgery was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and the preoperative paperwork had been requested, and Theo had asked his 2 questions. "Will it hurt? Will you be there when I wake up?" and received 2 honest answers. Sloane answered on the second ring. He told her about the letter, about the timestamp, about what it meant to him that she'd made the decision in that sequence. She was quiet for a moment before responding, and when she did, her voice carried something he hadn't heard in it before, not the CEO, not the tired woman over Thursday coffee, but something more direct and less armored. "I've spent 3 years in a world where everything is conditional, where every kindness has a price attached to it somewhere downstream." A pause. "I didn't want to be another person who made you do the math." There were things he could have said to that. Instead, "The boardroom meeting. When is it?" "Thursday." Her voice shifted back toward its operational register, though something of the previous quality remained. "Preston has proxies. He thinks he has enough. He doesn't know what I have. I want to be there." A silence that evaluated something. "Darius, not as staff, not in any capacity that requires an explanation." He chose his words with care. "As someone who was in the middle of this and would like to see it end in the same room where it ends." Another silence, longer, the kind she used to arrive somewhere rather than to fill space. "The meeting is at 9. Dress like you own stock." He didn't own stock, but he owned a suit he'd bought 4 years ago for a conference that now fit slightly differently, and he pressed it the night before with the iron that had one broken temperature setting and still functioned if you kept it moving. Theo watched him from the kitchen table, drawing in the focused way he drew when something was on his mind. "Are you going to fight the bad guy tomorrow?" Darius looked at his son. "I'm going to watch someone else do it, and make sure there are enough people in the room to see it happen." Theo considered this with the seriousness he brought to important distinctions. "That's still important. Witnesses matter." He returned to his drawing. "Mom used to say that. Witnesses matter." Darius stood at the ironing board for a moment without moving. "Yeah," he finally said. She was right. The meeting was held in the 42nd floor conference room of Mercer Properties Manhattan headquarters, a room with the proportions and light of a space designed to communicate permanence. Floor-to-ceiling windows on the south wall looked across lower Manhattan toward the harbor. The table seated 30. By 9:15, every seat was occupied with additional attendees standing along the north wall. Darius stood among them. Preston Hale arrived at 9:05 in a suit that announced itself accompanied by 2 attorneys and the particular composure of a man who had counted his votes and found them sufficient. He took a seat near the center of the table and arranged himself with the patience of someone attending a formality before an outcome he'd already secured. His eyes swept the room in a single practiced pass. When they reached Darius against the wall, they stopped for 1 second, then moved on. Sloane entered at 9:12. She was wearing the charcoal suit Darius recognized from the first Thursday, and she moved through the room the way she had moved through her penthouse during the dinner party, not performing authority, simply occupying it the way a person inhabits a space they've earned rather than one they've borrowed. She took her position at the head of the table, set down a single folder, and looked at the room without preamble. "I'll be brief," she said, and opened the folder. What followed was not brief, but it was precise. Sloane presented the documentation she had assembled over the preceding 3 weeks with the methodical clarity of someone who had learned through years of corporate warfare that the most devastating evidence was evidence that required no interpretation. Financial records tracing the acquisition of proxy shares through 6 shell companies back to a holding firm registered in Preston's name. Contract records from a private investigation firm subpoenaed through channels that Preston's attorneys would spend the next week trying to challenge. A timeline of media contacts showing the specific sequence of leaked photographs and planted sources. Then Wallace Price presented the recording. It was not dramatic. It was simply Preston's voice captured clearly by a phone in Wallace's breast pocket during a conversation Preston had initiated in what he'd believed was a private setting, discussing the specific mechanics of what he'd asked Darius to say and what he'd offered in exchange. The room listened in the particular quality of silence that occurs when people are hearing something they cannot unhear. Then Lena Schraft stood up. She was 19 years old and visibly nervous and entirely composed in the way that people are composed when they have decided that what they are about to say is simply true, and truth doesn't require performance. She described to a room of shareholders and attorneys and 2 senior board members what she had witnessed in the private dining room at Aurelius on a Thursday morning in January. A man who could have let her take the consequences of an accident had instead stepped in front of her and claimed responsibility he didn't have. That was all she had seen. She had no stake in what came after. She only knew what had actually happened. She sat down. The room was quiet. Preston's lead attorney leaned toward him and said something in a voice too low to carry. Preston's expression had not changed in any obvious way, but something had shifted in the room's orientation toward him, the subtle collective recalibration of people who had been prepared to vote one way and were now considering the full cost of that vote. The proxy count, when tallied, came up short by 11 votes. Preston Hale was removed from the board of Mercer Properties by a margin that was not close enough to contest and too public to survive. He left without speaking. His attorneys followed. The door closed and the room released the particular held breath of a space where something that had been building for years had finally resolved. Darius waited against the wall while the room emptied around him, the shareholder conversations moving into hallways and phones, the board members departing in pairs. He didn't move toward Sloane, who was fielding an immediate cluster of conversations at the head of the table. attorneys, a board member, someone from her communications team. He watched her manage it with the efficiency and precision he recognized from their Thursday mornings, the professional instrument fully engaged, doing what it was built to do. Eventually, the room cleared to 3 people, then 2, and then Sloane crossed toward him with her folder under her arm and the controlled bearing of someone who had just expended a significant quantity of everything they had. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him with an expression that was too tired for triumph and too relieved for anything more complicated. "You came. I told you I wanted to see it end." "What did it look like from where you were standing?" He thought about it honestly. Like someone who'd been building something for 30 years finally made it too solid for anyone to knock down. Something in her exhaled without moving. She looked at him for a moment with the direct, unguarded quality she occasionally produced when she'd forgotten to manage the distance between them. "Lena came on her own. I didn't ask her. She called Wallace 2 days ago and said she wanted to be here." A pause. "You did that. Not intentionally, just by being the kind of person who steps in front of things." "She did it herself. She made her own choice." "Yes." Sloane held his gaze. "People tend to do that when they've seen it modeled." They stood in the emptied conference room for a moment, the harbor visible through the south windows, the morning light moving across the table where Preston Hale had sat an hour ago and believed he had won. "Theo's surgery is Tuesday," Darius said. "I know. I'd like—" He started differently, choosing precision over ease. "I'd like you to be there, not in any official capacity, just there." Sloane looked at him for a long moment. The professional armor was fully down in a way he'd only seen in glimpses before, the tired woman behind the Forbes photographs, the person who got headaches and asked direct questions and arranged for a child's hospital bill to be paid before the test existed to pass it. "I'll be there," she said. "What time?" Tuesday arrived the way important days arrived, ordinary in its details, fully weighted in everything beneath them. Darius made breakfast that neither of them ate much of, helped Theo into clean clothes, and held his son's hand on the subway, without either of them needing to fill the silence. Theo had the rocket ship book in his backpack, the spine now fully separated, the pages soft at every corner. Sloane was already in the family waiting area when they arrived, sitting in one of the institutional chairs with a coffee she hadn't opened, dressed without the precision of her professional contexts, simpler, quieter, the version of herself that existed when no one required performing for. She stood when she saw them. Theo looked at her for a moment with the assessing attention he deployed when encountering something he'd formed a theory about and was now testing against reality. Then he crossed the waiting room, stood in front of her, and held out the rocket ship book. "I want you to hold this while I'm in there," he said. "It's for luck. But also," he considered his phrasing carefully, "so you have something to do while you wait. Waiting is hard." Sloane took the book with both hands. She looked at it, then at Theo, and something moved across her face that arrived directly from wherever she kept the things that were genuinely hers. "I'll take good care of it." Theo nodded, once satisfied. Then he turned to his father and held his arms up, and Darius lifted him and held him in the way he'd been holding him since a Tuesday night 2 months ago when a heart monitor had read 92%, and everything had narrowed to this weight, this specific warmth, this child who drew yellow light behind every person he loved. "I'll be right here," Darius told him, "every single minute." "I know." Theo pulled back and looked at his father with the clear, serious eyes of a child who had decided to be brave. "Don't let her read the whole book without me." The surgery lasted 4 hours and 19 minutes. Darius and Sloane sat in the waiting area through all of it, and the conversation they had was not about Mercer Properties or Preston Hale or Thursday mornings at Aurelius. It was about Renata, because Sloane asked directly and without performance, and the question deserved a direct answer. He told her about the specific quality of his wife's intelligence, the way she moved through problems by identifying the next practical step while he was still processing the size of the problem. He told her about the cemetery in Queens he visited once a month. He told her that Theo had inherited something from Renata that he couldn't fully name, some way of seeing people that cut straight to what was true about them. Sloane listened without filling the silences he left. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, then, "She sounds like someone who deserved more time." She did. He looked at his hands. "So does Theo." "Yes." Her voice was firm with something that wasn't consolation. "That's why we're here." The surgeon appeared in the doorway at 2:41 in the afternoon. The defect was fully repaired. The procedure was clean. Theo was awake in recovery and asking for his father. Darius stood at his son's bedside in the particular light of a recovery room, holding the small hand that was connected to a monitor displaying numbers that were for the first time in months simply numbers rather than verdicts. Theo's voice was slow and hoarse, navigating the fog of anesthesia with the deliberate care of someone working a difficult terrain. "Did you cry?" "Yes." A pause while Theo assessed this. "You said you wouldn't." "I said I wouldn't do anything wrong. Crying isn't wrong." The logic moved visibly across his son's face, testing its structure. "Okay," he decided. "That's fair." His eyes moved to the door. "Is she still here?" "Yes." "Tell her she can come in." A pause. "And tell her I didn't forget about her rocket ship. I'm building it when I'm better." Sloane came in quietly and sat in the chair on the opposite side of the bed, and Theo looked at her with the expression of someone checking that a theory had held up under the full weight of evidence. Then he reached out his other hand toward her, and she took it, and the three of them sat in the recovery room while the monitor kept its steady count and the afternoon moved past the window. Theo fell asleep holding both their hands. Neither of them moved to withdraw. 8 months later, on a Thursday morning in October, when the light had turned from summer white to the particular gold of a season preparing to end the table in the private dining room at Aurelius, was set for 3. Darius came through the front entrance. He'd been doing this for 4 months since the new management had called with a genuine apology and an offer he'd accepted because honest work was still honest work regardless of the address. He was also 3 months into a contract analyst position at a firm whose managing director had made his interest known through channels that no longer required explanation. The surgery fund notebook was still in the kitchen drawer. He hadn't thrown it away because the record of those increments every week, every calculation every Thursday, was also a record of what it looked like to refuse to stop. Sloane was at the table when he arrived, and Theo was beside her pointing to something in the rocket ship book with the focused urgency of a person making a technical argument to someone who was actually listening. Sloane was listening completely, her tablet nowhere in evidence, her phone face down, her full attention given over to a 6-year-old's explanation of deep space fuel efficiency. She looked up when Darius crossed the room, and the small, real smile appeared, not the professional curve she deployed in boardrooms, but the one that arrived without management, the one that changed the geometry of her face and made her look like the person she was when she wasn't performing anything. Theo produced a folded piece of construction paper from his jacket pocket and set it in front of Sloane with both hands, the formality of someone presenting something that had required significant effort over significant time. She unfolded it carefully. The rocket ship was drawn in the evolved style of 8 months of practice, detailed and ambitious, with 3 figures visible in the windows, and behind them in yellow crayon the shape that appeared in every version of this drawing, radiating light in all directions like a sun that had decided to travel with them. Sloane looked at the yellow figure for a long moment, then quietly, "Who's the yellow one?" Theo answered with the patient directness of someone explaining something that was simply true. "That's Darius's wife. She travels behind everyone so they don't have to look backward to know she's there." He studied the drawing one more time, checking his work. "I put her behind you too, because you're part of us now, so she watches over you too." Sloane looked up from the drawing to Darius across the table. He let her see the full version of what he was. The man with the surgery fund notebook, the analyst who'd spent 3 years doing whatever the next necessary thing was, the widower who still kept a promise to a cemetery in Queens, the father of a child who distributed yellow crayon light to the people he decided deserved it. He didn't look away from any of it, and neither did she. She folded the drawing with the same care she'd unfolded it and placed it in the inner pocket of her jacket close. "It's more than okay," she told Theo. Theo reached for the book, satisfied that the important business had been handled, and opened it to the page with the fuel diagrams. Sloane leaned in to see. Darius drank his coffee, the temperature exactly right, the way it had been every Thursday for months, and watched his son explain rocket propulsion to a billionaire who was listening like it was the most important conversation she'd had all week. Outside the window, October light moved across the street below. People in coats, the city doing what cities did, continuing indifferent, enormous. And at the table in the private dining room, in the particular warmth of a morning that required nothing except being present in it. 3 people sat with a children's book and a crayon drawing and coffee that was exactly the right temperature. Theo looked up from the fuel diagrams and addressed both of them with the equanimity of someone announcing something that had always been obvious. "We should do this every Thursday." Sloane looked at Darius. Darius looked at Sloane. The question between them was not about Thursdays. "Yes," Sloane said. "We should." The October light held everything evenly, the book, the drawing, the 3 figures at the table, and somewhere behind them all, steady and unhurried, a yellow light that had never actually left.